Thank you for joining us, Geoff. You've just come from Hong Kong, so I think that's a good pretext to ask you. It's now entering its fourth month of demonstrations. No one knows what's going to happen. It seems to be a problem without a solution. What's your view of things?
I think it's very worrying indeed. I think you've described it well. It's a problem without a solution. It's not clear what the end point of this is going to be. But I think one thing is for sure, that Hong Kong will never be the same again. At what point the issues settle down, what point the streets are cleared and people stay off the streets, I don't know, and I don't know how that's brought about. I think it's been very surprising that Beijing has been so reluctant to remove Carrie Lam and make some compromises and try and set up a better mechanism of negotiation with the demonstrators. But it could well become a significant black swan event in the world, not just in the region.
Do you think that the worst could happen, that there would be a Tiananmen 2.0 and they'll send in the tanks to crush the movement?
Well, I guess everything's possible. And the worrying thing there is that clearly the demands have gone beyond the extradition bill and greater consultation with the government to going to the heart of Beijing's concerns, which is the nature of the political system and the one country, two systems model, which is now increasingly being rejected on the street. So the longer this goes on, the more the demands of the demonstrators become more of a direct challenge to Beijing's authority. And I think that makes it very risky. However, it has to be ultimately the most extreme and last solution for Beijing, because it's not clear what the exit strategy for the military would be. And militaries are very reluctant to go in to conflict unless they know what the exit strategy, and it would be an unbelievable mess. But that is the worst outcome. But I think for sure the most predictable outcome is that Hong Kong will no longer be the same.
Look, at the end of the day, the situation for the protesters is hopeless on two counts, and Bilahari Kaukasan, the former Singaporean diplomat who tends to be quite outspoken, had an op-ed titled "Harsh Truths" about Hong Kong just the other weekend, making the point first, Hong Kong is Chinese territory and Hong Kongers are Chinese citizens. And when it comes to one country, two systems, Beijing has always emphasised one country, not two systems, and they always will. So he said, when it comes to the protesters, what country is going to give them more than rhetorical support? At the end of the day, where can they go? Nowhere and no one. Harsh truths, but fair comment, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's the harsh reality that the demonstrators have to face. Where does that lead, though? I mean, I think everyone knows that, and all governments recognise Hong Kong as an integral part of Chinese territory. Everyone supports the one country, two systems. The problem is that the two systems is basically over as a result of these demonstrations. Beijing will feel no compunction to continue with what's become increasingly a charade of two systems, and the mask will come off. Whether that requires Beijing to intervene violently in Hong Kong is still an open question, but things have changed irrevocably.
One thing that might trigger a crackdown would be if there were signs that this was somehow spreading to the mainland, although it started off as a quite specific local Hong Kong issue. As you say, it's now morphed into something else, and Beijing has been doing everything possible to make sure it doesn't spread. But in Tiananmen, of course, that was exactly what happened, that there were protests right across the country. It represented a threat to the regime. Do we need to put ourselves in Beijing's shoes and just look at the history of China and the instability that they've been through over the past century and even longer, with warlordism and civil war, the mass terror, the Cultural Revolution? Now, they are obsessed about order and stability above all else, but there's also good reason for that.
Exactly, and it's important in all aspects of looking at China's behaviour and actions that you also try and look at it through the lens of Beijing. I mean, we had an interesting comment this morning in the conference about Beijing may look to outsiders as strong, powerful, or China strong, powerful, united. But what the Beijing leadership feels are massive vulnerabilities and weakness. And I think that is also true in this situation, that a Beijing perspective on Hong Kong is, well, it was a British colonial territory. They never had democratic rights under the British. Why should this be an issue of concern? Sure, they control the media and the information flows to most Chinese people, but I think also amongst most Chinese people there would be very little sympathy for what's happening in Hong Kong.
Hong Kong's portrayed as a spoiled child.
Yes,
it's not,
exactly.
isn't appreciative enough of the privileges that it has.
No, exactly.
Because that's as good as it gets, as Bilahari Wilkerson said.
And that's right, yeah. And recall that over the last couple of years, there's been incidents between local Hong Kongese and Chinese visitors, mainland Chinese visitors, for crowding the shops and behaving badly or whatever.
Uncouth.
Uncouth, yeah, thank you. So there is an underlying resentment on both sides. So it goes back to the point that the demonstrators, I think, have really very few options and not much to hope for. I think it's a pity that the government of Hong Kong has not been better in bringing the disaffected people into a much better dialogue and making concessions on some of their demands. You know, the line has been, if we make any more concessions, then there'll be only more demands made. But holding that hard line has not mitigated against that. The demands have continued to increase. The situation has become worse, not better.
You mentioned vulnerabilities before. Now, the People's Republic of China turns 70, and we're going to see a massive display of strength, military parades, the latest high-tech gear, at a time when the regime, and Xi Jinping in particular, are under increasing pressure at home, at abroad. They've got Donald Trump's trade war, but also a more fundamental problem at home about how much control do they allow for in the economy and in society in order to move or to leapfrog into from the middle income trap up into the next income level. And it seems that they're moving in the opposite direction towards more control, more centralisation, more personalisation, just at the wrong time in China's development trajectory. But then there is this concern that if they liberalise or lessen the control, that there will be social unrest. Do you think that's a valid concern?
I think, well, one, they're very pragmatic when it comes to policy making. There is no ideology. Two, they know they need to maintain relatively high rates of growth. And I think they have the capacity to do that. So policy, if it's more on reform side or more on dirigist intervention side, will, I think, be shaped by the circumstances at the time, but always in order to sustain growth. So just recently, in the last week, they've actually liberalised interest rate setting, which is a proposal that the IMF and World Bank have been making for years to China. They've been very reluctant because of losing control over financial instruments, but they've moved now to a much more market-based exchange rate setting mechanism, interest rate setting mechanism, which will help the non-state sector and the small and medium-sized enterprises as well. I see.
Does that indicate to you a bit of a recalibration that Xi Jinping is, and the leadership is starting to listen to some of the advice? Yeah,
good question. Or you can look at it another way, that there is always a contest of ideas going on at the centre. And there's a range of views, and we tend to forget about that. We look at China as if it's monolithic and that there's Xi's view and no other view, but not at all. There is a range of views. There are a lot of highly educated advisors. There's Liu He, for example, the Vice Premier and leading economic policy person in the country after Xi, is North American, PhD, economic trained, fluent English. It's not for not knowing, but they're sitting on top of this enormous economy where stability is the overriding policy objective, and they pursue policy out of necessity rather than out of any philosophical predisposition.